You see it on the news quite a bit, like the issues between how police officers handle the arrests of Indigenous people.
Tonight, an internal investigation into a video showing an RCMP officer aggressively taking down an Indigenous man.
But there's other vulnerable First Nation communities in this province that we need to address.
The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations reacts to the James Smith Cree Nation inquest.
That has worked. That hasn't produced clean drinking water to the apps.
And working on ending the longest running boil water advisory in Canada. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. The Alberta RCMP are conducting an internal investigation into one of their own after a video surfaced that shows an officer aggressively taking down a handcuffed Indigenous man in December. APTN's Chris Stewart has more.
Raylan Fisher of the Fishing Lake Métis settlement stopped in Elk Point, Alberta with her family for a bite to eat. Nearby, she noticed an RCMP officer confronting a man. She told APTN that she had a feeling that something might happen, so she recorded the confrontation on her phone. Her video shows a single RCMP officer taking down an Indigenous man who was handcuffed. The officer throws the man hard to the ground. You see his face hit the concrete. The man went limp for 10 seconds before being lifted up by the officer.
You see it on the news quite a bit, like the issues between how police officers handle the arrests of Indigenous people.
He should not.
Jim White is a former 30-year veteran of the Edmonton Police Service. After seeing the video, the Métis former officer told APTN that this is not a proper protocol for an officer to take down someone who was already handcuffed.
He didn't seem to be steady on his feet. And when he was grabbed from the back like that, spun, and basically spun from one side of the police vehicle to the other, and face slammed him into the concrete. That in itself is totally contrary to direction given by the Law Enforcement Review Board.
White says there needs to be repercussions for officers who go against safety policies.
You could deal with a person when you have him handcuffed. He was defenseless. He couldn't protect himself on the fall. He couldn't break the fall. The police officer didn't appear to be in any danger whatsoever.
APTN spoke to the man who was taken down. He does not want his identity known. He showed APTN photos of his face with cuts and bruises. In a statement to APTN, the RCMP say that officers responded to a report of an assault in progress. The man in the video was charged with assault on an individual and uttering threats and resisting arrest to the officers. The RCMP say an internal investigation on the incident is ongoing and will escalate if criminal wrongdoing is suspected. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
First Nations across Canada are now reacting to the recommendations made at the inquest into the stabbings on the James Smith Cree Nation. The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations held a press conference on Thursday in Saskatoon, where Indigenous leadership across Canada had an opportunity to reflect on the recommendations. Reporter Rachel May has more.
Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse was at the press conference.
The James Smith Cree Nation tragedy shows as a prime example of how the lack of local First Nations police and justice services added to the vulnerabilities.
Woodhouse was surrounded by chiefs from across Saskatchewan, RCMP, and family members of those who lost their lives. With 29 recommendations from the jury and coroner to consider, Chelsea Stonestand was disheartened to hear none for the Parole Board of Canada. She said that there's a clear imbalance within the Parole Board.
There's 7 Indigenous Parole Board members, and there's 72 non-Indigenous Parole Board members. That's a strong disparity for Indigenous people.
When it comes to the RCMP commanding officer, Rhonda Blackmore said funding needs to be in place to help all 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan.
A horrific tragedy that happened at James Smith, but there's other vulnerable First Nation communities in this province that we need to address.
Recommendations can take between 3 and 6 months to be implemented, but Blackmore says she's working on reviewing and implementing the recommendations concerning the RCMP. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Closing in on 3 decades, it is known as the First Nation with the longest boil water advisory in Canada. On Thursday, Neskantaga First Nation Chief Chris Muñoz met with Indigenous Services Minister Patty Haidu to talk about solutions to ending the 29-year-old advisory. Both parties are currently working on a 12-point plan to establish safe drinking water for all homes in the community that is in Northern Ontario. Both sides agree a new water treatment plant will be needed to provide sustainable, safe drinking water. Muñoz says he is cautiously optimistic things are moving in the right direction, but also remains skeptical.
And back in 2017, I believe it was, or 16, we were told by then Minister Bennett that, we're going to have clean drinking water by 2018 when they announced the upgrade of our current water system. And this hasn't worked for the upgrade hasn't worked. That hasn't produced clean drinking water to the taps.
Statistics released by the Yukon's Coroner Service show that First Nations people made up the majority of opioid-related deaths in 2023. The service recorded a total of 23 substance use-related deaths last year. Of those deaths, 20 of them involved opioids, 14 of which were First Nations. 13 of those deaths were male, 19 occurred in Whitehorse, and those in their 30s are most affected. That number is just one less than the 24 people who died due to substance use in 2022. The deaths represent 23% of all cases investigated by the service last year. The city of Whitehorse will soon be getting a second warming center to help keep people out of the cold this spring. Yukon government announced it will open its own warming center pilot project in the former cafeteria at the James Smith building. Those using the center will have access to things like internet, outreach services, snacks, and harm reduction supplies. It will be open weekdays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. from March 18th to May 1st. It's part of a government action plan to make the downtown core safer for all. The territory's Director of Social Support says the center's hours will also correspond to the temporary closure of the Whitehorse Public Library.
We do know that there is a fairly dedicated group of people that do attend the library for things like the internet and such, so certainly we anticipate some of those folks may head over here, and obviously anybody else is welcome.
The nonprofit Safe at Home Society opened a warming center at the former High Country Inn building last month. It will operate until late March. Time to step aside for a quick break. Still to come, we'll take a look at Welcome back. Members of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans were back to work on Thursday, and they continued to look at illegal and unregulated fishing. Naomi Metallic was one of the first witnesses. She's an associate professor at Dalhousie University and a member of the Listigouche, Mi'kmaq First Nation in Quebec. In her opening statement, Metallic said in Nova Scotia there are currently 55 First Nation fishers in ongoing prosecutions under the Fisheries Act, and that many should be constitutionally protected. She said it's less of an enforcement or illegal fisheries problem than the failure of Canada to respect and accommodate Indigenous treaty rights. When asked by Liberal MP Mike Kellaway what is needed to help officers to understand those rights, Metallic said education.
My home community of Listigouche does have a rangers program that we have had for about 20 plus years. And I think that they do work with local enforcement. And so there's a relationship. So a lot of it is about collaboration and relationship building. But I think it requires sort of the change in perspective of being a partner with Indigenous nations as opposed to simply them just being stakeholders in this.
The Chief and Council of a Mi'kmaq First Nation in Nova Scotia have closed the band office and some other services. It comes as a checkpoint put up by some band members, now drags into its second week. Angel Moore brings us that story.
I'm here at the Annapolis Valley First Nation, where a checkpoint has been set up on the corner of Ratchford Road and Guau Lane. At first, only band members and staff were allowed into the community. It's been organized by Shanika McCackern. She's frustrated with lack of housing and no answers from Chief and Council.
I went down to see them and they're refusing to talk to me, not getting anywhere with the housing issue. I start talking to other people and they're saying that, you know, I'm having issues with the same thing in not getting replies. So
the protest began over 10 days ago. With a fire to stay warm, people camp overnight, including Chadwick Thorpe Tony. He wants to bring his family back to his community.
And every time I keep getting told the exact same words, oh, you're top of the list, or oh, we have a place just for you, or just hold on a little longer. And I just keep getting told those words two years now in a row, each getting told the exact same words. And I still see no house and no action.
The protesters are demanding a meeting with Chief and Council to discuss housing, support for education, youth and elders. Roger Tony says they are prepared to stay.
We're prepared to bunk down here for the winter and get our point across until we can have a meeting with Chief and Council.
But now there are few cars on this road to check on. That's because since Monday, the band office, the school, health clinic and daycare center have all been closed. There's been no explanation from leadership, except the sign on the health center, closed till further notice.
No education, no health care. It's just, you know, it's an abuse of leadership power. And that's, you know, it's not something that our community is going to deal with.
Tony says the protest has been peaceful. The road is not blocked. Constable Dominique Laflamme told APTN News the police are aware of the protests and have not had to intervene. No one knows when the band office, school and health centre will reopen. Chief Gerald Tony did not respond to multiple interview requests. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Annapolis Valley, Mi'kmaq Nation.
Thanks, Angel. Time for one last quick break. Still to come, our Truth and Politics panel is looking at legislation to recognize certain Métis governments. Stick around. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Regular viewers of the newscast, Alan and Mary Lee Brand sent in this stunning sunset as seen from their Toronto, Ontario balcony. Thanks for watching and for sending in tonight's photo of the day. Remember, photos can be sent to share@aptn.ca to be featured during our newscast. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, -3 with snow in Halifax, 4 below in Fredericton. -21 in Kuujjuaq, 18 below for Nain. -4 in Montreal, cloudy and 0 for Val-d'Or. Sun's out and +4 for Sault Ste. Marie, a sunny -3 in North Bay. 0 with cloud in Thunder Bay, sunny and 2 for Sioux Lookout. 3 in God's Lake and Norway House. +4 for Winnipeg and Dauphin, 6 in Brandon. 6 in Regina, 4 above for Saskatoon. Cloudy and +2 for Meadow Lake, 0 in Buffalo Narrows. In northern Alberta, sunny and -8 in High Level, -1 for Fort McMurray. 3 above in Edmonton, +5 for Lethbridge. 9 in Vancouver, 6 in Kamloops. -3 in Prince George and Smithers, 8 below in Dease Lake. Snow and minus 30 for Old Crow, 23 below in Whitehorse. Minus 24 in Yellowknife, 29 below in Norman Wells. Snow and minus 20 for Sachs Harbor, 22 below with snow in Paulatuck. Minus 10 in Chesterfield and Whale Cove, 6 below in Arviat. Minus 24 in Resolute, 18 below in Joe Haven. Last June 21st, on Indigenous Solidarity Day, the federal government introduced Bill C-53, an act respecting the recognition of certain Métis governments in Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. C-53 has passed second reading. Third reading is expected soon after the current round of committee meetings wraps up. For more on this, we turn to our Truth and Politics panel. Carrie Benjo is editor of Eagle Feather News in Regina, and Egon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. We spoke yesterday. Carrie and Egon, thanks for being with us again this week. Egon, Bill C-53 appeared out of nowhere. It's almost ready for third reading. Can you give us a bit of a rundown, I guess, of what's in it?
It did come out of nowhere, perhaps, I think, for certain segments of the political communities in Canada. But I mean, certainly for a long time, the Liberals have been trying to court what they see as Métis peoples. They've had a long-standing relationship with the Red River Métis in Manitoba. And so it perhaps comes as no surprise they see a constituency amongst other Métis communities, some which are seen by the Red River Métis as legitimate and other ones in Ontario which are considered illegitimate. The problem with this bill, of course, is that it really recognizes Section 35 rights or constitutional rights for Métis communities which are under discussion, under debate, and are seen as illegitimate by many people who are the actual Métis Nation here in Manitoba. And so by recognizing that those communities in Ontario, which Ontario recognizes, the Métis National Council recognizes, which includes kind of the stalwarts of in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and of course MNC President Cassidy Caron, it is giving rights to those Métis peoples, or those peoples who are calling themselves Métis, who are using the symbols of the Red River Métis and don't have any historical claim to that nation. And so it's become a real mess. And as members for the Manatoba M Federation says, it's actually backwards, because it recognizes that any treaties that are created either have been signed, and there's an agreement, self-government agreements that signed last February, or those agreed in the future will be therefore with people who are not actually Métis.
Carrie, why do you think the Liberals introduced this bill in the first place?
Well, like Egon had mentioned, this is something that has been in the works. And I think that, you know, in their term and this movement towards reconciliation, this was just one of the areas that they wanted to address. And it may have appeared to have come out of nowhere, but I think there has been a lot of groundwork in place. And I think for a lot of us within the First Nations community, we have been disconnected from what is happening among the Métis, which is, I think, on us for not keeping in touch and keeping those lines of communication and understanding what the Métis people are experiencing, because we do have a shared history. And I think this disconnect is feeding some of the problems that we're seeing today.
Egon, you mentioned the Manatoba M Federation. They're not part of this legislation. They're working on their own modern-day treaty that they hope is passed before the end of the year. What are the differences in the two deals?
It can be very complicated, I think, for people who are not involved in the politics and the conversations that are happening in the Métis Nation of that Métis National Council, of which the Manitoba Métis Federation was a founding member, and have now separated over this issue of Métis communities in Ontario, who the MMF claim have no historical claim about being Métis, and genealogically certainly have no connection. If anything, they are mixed blood people who descend from from First Nations in Ontario and may now have their own identity, but you wouldn't see so according to the images that they use or the stories that you use, which are all from Manitoba. They are not talking about even their own territories, and so it's highly problematic. And that by this bill coming in, it's saying that Métis people are the same across the prairies and into Ontario, which they simply are not. And so that's where it really gets into a stepping into, which are two issues. One is it is the federal government declaring and recognizing those who are Métis when many Métis don't recognize. Even those within the Métis Nation of Alberta and Saskatchewan don't recognize those within Ontario as being Métis or having historical connections. And the second is, this is really a First Nations rights issue, because when you recognize people in Ontario as having Section 35 claims, constitutional claims as Indians, Indigenous peoples within the country, what you're saying is that that is then in the same category as First Nations rights, and naturally that will impede on those First Nations in Ontario. And so what this is really paternalistic. It is highly colonial for a government to make the determination in what really should be a conversation between Métis peoples or people who claim to be Métis about ultimately what does it mean to be part of a national Métis nation. And frankly, I think the Red River Métis have the strongest claim and the right to be able to have be a leader in that discussion. Separate bills is not going to be the way in which we bring people together for this conversation.
Kerry, as Nigon said, First Nations really from coast to coast have raised concerns about this bill, particularly when it comes to the Métis Nation of Ontario. Do you think there's any chance we might see this bill not pass, not receive royal assent?
There has been a lot of discussion, a lot of pushback from First Nations in regards to the bill, but it's making its way through. It remains to be seen whether or not it's their protests against it will make a difference, but I think they have very legitimate concerns, because when we're talking about this, there's this it's about citizenship. But in reality, if we're recognizing people that don't have a connection to the land, Indigenous people within the Métis province of the Ontario, they are concerned about, whether or not this group that doesn't have a traditional connection to the land will suddenly be the ones, deciding the future of land use. And I think that's a big issue, because when we talk about duty to consult, they should be talking to people that have that historic traditional connection to the land, because that affects them and their future generations, not people that don't have that history, and I think that's what a lot of First Nations chiefs have brought up, is that, although it's talking about citizenship and membership and things like that, ultimately it's about land. And so that's an issue that is of a concern, not only to Indigenous people, First Nations people within Ontario, but all across Canada.
Kerry, Nigon, big topic, hard to discuss even within 7 minutes, but appreciate you taking the time to do so today.
Thanks.
And if you want to catch up on any of our previous Truth and Politics panels, you can head on over to our APTN News YouTube page. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Friday. Of course, for news anytime, you can visit our website. That's aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward, Marcy Miigwech. Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.